This video will walk you through the user study of CodePod IDE. This is the GitHub repo of the user study. In this repo, you will find the following content. First, the introduction to CodePod IDE. Second, how to use the CodePod app. Then there are 2 steps to follow. First, do the user study, then complete the questionnaires. There are 4 questions in the questionnaire. In short, we prepared 3 Jupyter notebooks as benchmarks, and your task is to run these notebooks in CodePod to experience the tool, and then complete a questionnaire of 4 questions. You can also use CodePod on any other projects as you wish to experience the app before you complete the questionnaire. These are some quick links to the relevant content. For an introduction and tutorial of the CodePod IDE, please click this YouTube video. In short, CodePod has these 4 features. A 2D canvas-based UI, organized code in nested scopes. We have semantic meanings for the scopes. Finally, we have def-use visualization to help you figure out the relations among the pods. These are the major features of CodePod over Jupyter, and we will ask you to evaluate these features in the questionnaires. Now, let's talk about the user study. First step is to do the user study. We prepared 3 Jupyter notebooks. These are the links to the notebooks. You can run these notebooks in CodePod in 2 ways. You can work from scratch by copying each code cell one by one into CodePod, or you can import the notebook into CodePod and work from there. In this video, we'll demonstrate both approaches. Once you completed all 3 notebooks, you should be experienced with the tool. You can go ahead and complete the questionnaires. There are 4 questions. Basically, in each question, your task is to fill in a table. This table, this table, this table, and this table. For each question, you can also add your comments in any form. This is also important for us to understand your feeling behind the numbers in your table. Basically, that's it. And now, let's go through the MNIST example. Let's first overview the MNIST notebook. This is a neural network classifier for the fashion MNIST dataset. First, we install some libraries and then import the libraries. This is the device to use. For this user study, we'll just use the CPU. Then we download the training and testing data and load them with the PyTorch dataset API. This cell prints the information of the data. Next, we have a function to sample 9 images and visualize them. These are the images from the dataset. This is the neural network model, and we have the training procedure and the testing procedure. Now we create the model, define the loss function and optimizer, and start the training process. After the model is trained, we can run the model on the test data and visualize the results. Here's the test image, and this is the predicted class and the actual class. Now let's use CodePod to develop the notebook. Let's create a new project. First, we copy this code cell, create a Python pod, and paste it in. Let's start the Python kernel. While the Python kernel is starting, let's copy some other cells. Now our runtime is ready. We can start to install the packages. Copy the training data code. So basically what we're doing on CodePod is to copy the pods here and move them around to organize them on the canvas. As we can see, CodePod automatically recognize the variables and functions defined in the pods and show edges between def and use. This will help you easily see the relations and organize the pods accordingly. Now the libraries are installed, we can now run this pod to import the libraries. Then let's download the training data. One thing to notice is that we are using the path /mnt/data. This path is special on CodePod runtimes, as it mounted with the user volume on CodePod. This volume is shared across projects and kernel restarts. Other directories will be reset when the kernel restarts and data will be lost. Therefore, we use this path here so that the data will not be re-downloaded. Now the dataset is ready. We can print some information of the dataset. Note that if we run this pod first, it will throw an error saying that the function is not defined. That's because we need to run this pod first before we can run this one. And now we can see that the data is correctly visualized. And let's see what's next. The next is to define the model. Before that, at this point, we can actually create a module. These pods are related to data loading, so we can create a scope. Now this scope is related to data loading. We can also add a markdown document and say this is data loading module to give it a name. All right, let's continue with the next code cell. So this is the neural network model. We'll create a new Python pod and paste it in. And we have the training procedure and the test procedure. Next code cell, create the model. Then we have the loss function and the optimizers. And we have the training epochs. So the edges might become pretty messy. This is the messy relationships in Jupyter cells, and CodePod is here to clear it out. One practice is to order the edges in one direction. For example, from top left to bottom right, so that it is easier to see the flow of dependencies. These are all the code related to model and training, and we can create a scope for it. One thing we can do here is that this device pod is kind of a global variable, so we can put it out. We can create a scope that includes all the training pods. This device will be an external thing. The edge will be much cleaner, as there will be only one edge from the device pod to the model training module, and we have a cleaner edge relations inside the module. In the module, we have the train and test procedures here. We have the neural network model here, and we create the model, create the loss function and optimizer, and finally start training. Now let's run this. We first run the class and function definitions, then create the model and optimizer, and finally do the training. Here there's an error saying the train_data loader is not defined. That is because the training data loader is inside another module. To make it available to the outside, we need to make it public. Now if we run it again, okay, so the train data loader is actually this one. We don't need this one, but we need to make this one public. The train data loader is now public. And now let's run the training. Now the training procedure is running. We can now add a markdown document saying this module is model and training. While the model is training, let's continue to do the rest. So here are the evaluation cells. Let's copy them to CodePod. Let's put them in a scope and create a note that this is evaluation module. These are all the code from the Jupyter Notebook. This is the data loading module. This is the model and training. And this is evaluation. We can organize the modules a little. As you can see, a major process in using CodePod is to organize the pods and scopes. The merits are that the relationships among the code blocks are much cleaner. So the model is now trained. The accuracy is 64%. Now let's do the evaluation. We have the visualize one function, then we do the model evaluation here. Again, we are organizing the pods from top left to bottom right. Now the error says the model is not defined because the model is in the module of model and training. So we need to make it public to be visible out of the scope. Now the model is public. We can now run this pod again. Now it says test data is not defined. So the test data is right here, so we need to make this pod public. Now we can see that there are edges between the scopes. We can reorganize the scopes according to the edges. So the data loading, device, training, and evaluation. We can now run the evaluation. We can see that we load a test image and the model predicted the label of the image. All right, so that is it. We showed how to put the MNIST notebook in CodePod from scratch. At this point, let's compare Jupyter and CodePod using this notebook. In Jupyter, we have a linear notebook of all code cells. As you can see, it is quite long, and it is quite difficult to figure out the dependencies of the code blocks. And if you need to change some code, it is very hard to figure out what are the related code cells to change together or what cells to rerun. Now, let's move to CodePod. We have the same project on CodePod. Recall that we have three main differences compared with Jupyter. First, we have 2D canvas. It is more flexible to position the code blocks. For example, you can put them side by side. Second, we have a hierarchy of nested scopes, and scopes have semantics to encapsulate functions and variables local to the scopes. Last but not least, we have the def use edges to visualize the complex relations among the code blocks. Let's see these features using this project. First, we can move the pods freely on the 2D canvas. We can put relevant code close to each other instead of far away on a linear notebook. Second, we have scopes. We use different scopes to encapsulate the data loading, model training, and the evaluation. We have clean separation of different modules. Finally, we have the edges to visualize def-use relations. We know exactly what functions are used in which pods. And we also know the relations between the modules. When we want to change something, it is very easy to figure out what are the related pods to change together. Let's name this approach 1, copy from scratch. Now let's do the second approach to import a Jupyter notebook into CodePod. We create a new project and delete the default pods. First, you can download this notebook by this download link. or you can clone this user study repository. And in CodePod, you can right-click and choose Import Jupyter Notebook. Find the Jupyter Notebook file. Once you imported the notebook file, all the pods will be imported from left to right. Now you don't need to copy them one by one. As you can see, Markdown will be imported as well. The main work is organize the pods on the 2D canvas and nested scopes. These two pods are installing and importing the libraries. And we have the device global variable. Next is the data loading. So we have the dataset, the data loader, and the visualization. These are the dataset pods. Next, we have the neural network model, the train and test functions. Then we have the model instance and the training epochs. So these are the model and training pods. Finally, we have the evaluation pods. Now let's put the different group of pods into scopes to better organize and encapsulate them. As we can see, this pod and this pod have outgoing edges to other pods, meaning that these two should be public pods of the scope. So now we create a scope, and we actually want to make these two pods public. Now this module has two edges to the rest of the world. Next, the model training pods. As we can see, this model pod has an outgoing edge. So once we create the scope, we want to make this model pod public. Next, the evaluation pods. These pods do not have any outgoing edges, so we just make it a scope. And now we can organize the modules a little bit. This becomes very similar to the project using the previous from scratch approach. We now refine the positioning of the pods so that the edges always go from top left to bottom right. That should be it. We have organized the pods and scopes. Now we can start to run these. Let's start the Python kernel first. We'll first install the packages and import the libraries. Let's wait a little bit for the package installation. Okay, now the package is installed. Let's first load the data. As you can see, the data is loaded and visualized correctly. Now let's run this device pod. Let's first clear all existing results imported from the notebook. We can now run the model and training. Okay, the model training is done. Now we can do the evaluation. Let's try to change to another test data. For example, we use the second test image, and the model correctly predicted the label. All right, that's the second approach to import a Jupyter notebook and organize the pods on CodePod. That's the walkthrough of running the first MNIST Jupyter notebook on CodePod. You can try this notebook yourself. And then you can walk on the second and third Jupyter notebooks on CodePod. Once you finish these 3 projects, you should have a good understanding of the CodePod tool. You can go ahead and complete the questionnaires.